The Festival of Lights erupted across the grand amphitheater of Noctis 9, a spectacle of brilliance and shadow that drew thousands of beings from across the twilight world. Bioluminescent flowers bloomed along the pathways, their petals unfurling in rhythmic patterns that guided spectators to their seats. Above, the cavern ceiling sparkled with embedded crystals that caught and multiplied the glow of the dim star visible through strategically carved apertures in the planetary crust. In the center stage, Eshra Vond stood resplendent, his exoskeleton refracting light through 1,000 natural prisms that had evolved over millennia of Xyrillian adaptation to this world of perpetual dusk. His faceted eyes, each containing what his species proudly called million-facet vision, swept across the gathered assembly with unmistakable pride. "Citizens of Noctis 9," Eshra's voice resonated through the chamber, amplified by the natural acoustics of the cavern. "We gather once more to celebrate our greatest achievement, the conquest of darkness." The crowd chittered and hummed their approval, a symphony of different species expressing joy in their own ways. For generations, the Xyrillian people have led the way in perfecting Noctovision, in seeing what others cannot, in illuminating the shadows that once threatened our ancestors. Eshra gestured dramatically, and the overhead bioluminescent panels dimmed in response. The gathered species leaned forward in anticipation, eyes widening, pupils dilating, ocular implants whirring almost imperceptibly as they adjusted to the diminishing light. "Observe," he commanded, and with practiced precision, he identified objects placed at increasing distances throughout the amphitheater, first easily visible items, then progressively smaller and more obscured ones, until finally, he described in perfect detail a microglyph etched on a stone at the farthest reaches of the cavern, invisible to most beings present. The crowd erupted in applause. Eshra's demonstration was the pinnacle of their cultural achievement, mastery over the dark through biological and technological evolution. On a world orbiting a dim star, where shadows were the dominant landscape, the ability to see had become more than survival. It had become art, religion, and identity. Councillor Thurek, an elder whose skin had faded from vibrant aquamarine to a pale blue over his many cycles, nodded his approval from the council's elevated platform. His own ocular implants, an older generation but still impressive, glinted in the low light. 6 other council members flanked him, each representing different species who had adapted to Noctis 9's particular conditions. Just as Eshra prepared to introduce the next competitor, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned toward the eastern entrance, where a small delegation approached. Their movements were confident but somehow different, lacking the characteristic pause and scan most species exhibited when navigating the twilight world. Humans. The ambassadorial team from Earth had arrived only 3 cycles ago, establishing preliminary contact with the Noctis 9 Council. This was their first public appearance at a cultural event, and their timing could not have been more pointed. The Festival of Lights was sacred to many species here. Thurek rose to his feet, gesturing for the humans to be shown to the diplomatic observation box. "We welcome our visitors from Earth," he announced formally, though his inner eyelids flickered with barely concealed curiosity. The human delegation consisted of 5 individuals, but it was the woman at their center who drew every eye. Dr. Mara Albright moved with an assurance that seemed almost blasphemous in this world of careful navigation. Her adaptive suit, a marvel of human engineering, seemed to absorb ambient light rather than reflect it, creating a subtle void around her form. When she stepped into a patch of bioluminescent glow, the light dimmed ever so slightly, as though reluctant to touch her. "The Council of Noctis 9 honors us with their invitation." Mara spoke, her voice carrying clearly. Unlike Ashara's theatrical projection, her words were measured, calm, yet somehow more penetrating. "We come to observe, to learn, and perhaps, if the Council permits, to share." Eshra's mandibles clicked in what those familiar with Xyrillian expressions recognized as thinly veiled disdain. Our human friends arrive at an opportune moment. They can witness the culmination of evolutionary perfection, species who have conquered the dark through sight rather than hiding from it. If the barb landed. Mara gave no indication. Instead, she smiled, a human expression that still unsettled some of the more traditional Noctis 9 residents. Ambassador Vond speaks truth. We have much to learn from your mastery of vision. Earth's evolutionary path took us in different directions. Thurek gestured for the festival to continue, though his attention remained fixed on the human delegation. Something in Dr. Albright's tone suggested she was holding back. And centuries of political negotiations had taught him to recognize when a revelation was imminent. The festival proceeded through 3 more demonstrations. A luminarid who could perceive and interpret quantum fluctuations in light particles. A pair of voidwalkers who had developed retinal crystals capable of magnifying the faintest starlight 1,000-fold. And a young morphic whose skin could transform into perfect reflective patterns that created illusory light where none existed. Throughout it all, the humans watched with polite interest, occasionally murmuring among themselves. Beside Mara stood Lieutenant Carlo, whose fingers occasionally twitched toward what appeared to be a small device clipped to his belt. His eyes, unenhanced by any visible technology, scanned the performances with what seemed to be professional assessment rather than awe. When the scheduled demonstrations concluded, Eshra returned to center stage, his exoskeleton now fully illuminated from within, a Xyrillian display of dominance and celebration. As is our tradition, we open our festival to any who wish to demonstrate their own mastery of light and vision, he announced, though his gaze fixed pointedly on the human delegation. It was a challenge rarely accepted by visitors, a courtesy that typically went unused. Dr. Mara Albright rose to her feet. A ripple of surprise moved through the amphitheater. Eshra's inner mandibles flexed in what might have been satisfaction or alarm. Even those well-versed in Xyrillian expressions couldn't be certain. The council recognizes Dr. Mara Albright of Earth, Thurek announced, using her full title with deliberate formality. The stage is yours, Doctor. Mara descended from the diplomatic box with Lieutenant Carlo 1 step behind her. Their movements were synchronized, practiced, suggesting this moment was neither spontaneous nor unprepared. The crowd fell silent as they reached center stage, standing opposite Eshra, whose luminescent display now seemed slightly excessive in contrast to their subdued appearance. Citizens of Noctis 9, Mara began, her voice carrying effortlessly across the now silent amphitheater. You have shown us wonders of vision that our world has never achieved. Your evolutionary path has led to magnificent adaptations that allow you to conquer darkness through sight. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembly. On Earth, we took a different path. Instead of evolving to see in darkness, she nodded to Kalo, who removed the small device from his belt. We learned to create it. Carlo pressed a sequence on the device, the Night Forge, as humans called it, and a sphere of absolute darkness appeared between them. It wasn't shadow or absence of light. It was active darkness, a perfect void that seemed to swallow the ambient glow of the amphitheater. The sphere expanded slowly, deliberately, until it was the size of a small dwelling. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps of shock rippled through the crowd. Several luminarids recoiled physically, their light-sensitive membranes contracting in distress. A group of morphics near the front began to emit alarm pheromones that created flickering patterns across their skin. Most shocking to the assembled species was not just the darkness itself, but what it revealed, their fear. On a world where visibility was synonymous with safety, true darkness was more than unfamiliar. It was primal terror. Eshra's bioluminescence flared in what could only be interpreted as alarm. "What trickery is this?" he demanded, his composed diplomatic veneer cracking slightly. His faceted eyes worked furiously, adjusting, seeking any edge of light, finding none. No trickery, Ambassador, Mara replied calmly. The Night Forge creates a field that temporarily absorbs all photons within its radius. What you're experiencing is true darkness, not shadow, not dim light, but the complete absence of visible light. Councillor Thurick had risen to his feet, along with the other council members. Unlike the general alarm of the crowd, his expression held something more complex. Concern mixed with undeniable fascination. This demonstration was not approved, he stated, his voice carrying the weight of authority despite its moderate volume. You will deactivate this device immediately. Carlo looked to Mara, who nodded almost imperceptibly. He pressed another sequence, and the sphere of darkness collapsed, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The return of light, even the dim twilight of Noctis 9, prompted a collective sigh of relief from the assembly. But before stability could fully return, Mara spoke again. What you just witnessed was merely the canvas. Now, let me show you the art. Before Thurick could protest, Carlo activated the Night Forge again, but differently. This time, rather than a simple sphere, tendrils of darkness flowed outward, curling and spiraling into the air like living smoke. They twisted and turned with deliberate grace, forming patterns that somehow remained visible despite being made of absence. On Earth, we call this dark sculpting, Mara explained as Kalo manipulated the device with the precision of a virtuoso. We create controlled voids, perfect darkness that we shape and mold, not to induce fear, but to craft beauty from nothingness. The dark tendrils danced above the crowd, now forming what resembled a flowering plant, now transforming into abstract geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with negative energy. Rather than absorbing all light around them, these shapes selectively created boundaries of darkness, allowing the contrast between light and absolute dark to create definition. Some in the crowd began to lean forward rather than recoil. A few of the younger Morphics had overcome their initial alarm and were watching with undisguised wonder as shadows formed impossible shapes overhead. Impossible, Eshra muttered, though whether in denial or amazement was unclear. His faceted eyes tracked the movements of the dark shapes, continuously attempting to penetrate their perfect blackness and continuously failing. Mara stepped forward, her hands raised as though conducting the performance. In darkness, we discovered a truth your world has perhaps overlooked. Vision is but one way to experience reality. When sight is removed, other senses awaken, as if to demonstrate. She walked directly into one of the floating void shapes, disappearing from view. Her voice continued from within the darkness. In absence, we find presence. In blindness, we find insight. She emerged from another dark tendril several meters away, a demonstration that drew murmurs of astonishment. The darkness wasn't merely visual, she was navigating within it. Thurick watched with intensity that bordered on reverence. How do you navigate without sight? He asked, his voice barely audible above the crowd's reactions. Lieutenant Kalo answered while continuing to manipulate the Night Forge. We developed other systems, touch, sound, proprioception. Some humans can navigate by echo, others by feeling air currents or temperature gradients. The Night Forge enhances these alternatives. Eshra's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation among Xerillians. This is a parlor trick, he declared. Impressive technology, certainly, but hardly evolutionary mastery. Your species created darkness because you cannot see in it naturally. Mara emerged fully from the darkness, standing before Ashara with a smile that contained neither mockery nor defensiveness. Precisely, Ambassador. We created darkness because we cannot see in it. We turned our evolutionary limitation into creative opportunity. The demonstration might have continued, might have even won over more of the increasingly fascinated crowd, had it not been for what happened next. A high-pitched whine emanated from the Night Forge, barely perceptible at first, then rising to a concerning pitch. Kalo's expression shifted from concentration to alarm. Power fluctuation, he said urgently to Mara. "The local electromagnetic field is stronger than our preliminary scans indicated." "Shut it down," Mara ordered immediately. But Kayla was already working the controls. "It's not responding to the standard override. The absorption field is—" He never finished the sentence. With a sound like air rushing into a vacuum, the Night Forge's field expanded exponentially. In an instant, the entire amphitheater was plunged into absolute, perfect darkness. Not the twilight darkness of Noctis 9's natural state, but a void so complete it seemed to press against the skin, to fill the lungs, to crowd the mind with its absoluteness. The crowd's reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. Screams and clicks and subsonic vibrations, the sounds of dozens of species expressing terror in their native ways, echoed through the cavern. Bioluminescent organisms flickered desperately, trying to penetrate the unnatural dark, but their light was swallowed before it could travel more than millimeters. "Everyone, remain calm." Thurek's voice cut through the rising panic. "Emergency protocols. Activate your personal illuminators." Throughout the amphitheater, small emergency beacons, standard equipment for all residents despite rarely being needed, sparked to life. But their light, too, was immediately devoured by the expanding darkness. In the center of the stage, Mara and Kalo worked frantically, their hands moving by touch alone over the Night Forge. "The field's expanding beyond parameters," Kalo reported, his training keeping his voice steady despite the crisis. "At this rate, it could envelope the entire settlement in minutes." Eshra's voice came from nearby, his natural bioluminescence completely extinguished by the field. "What have you done, human? Is this your true purpose? To blind us all?" "It's a malfunction," Mara replied tersely. "Lieutenant, the isolation circuit. Can you bypass it?" Trying, but without visual confirmation, his fingers worked blindly over the device's surface. "I need to see the connection points." "From the council platform." Thurek's voice again. "Evacuation procedures initiated. All citizens, follow the sonic guides to the emergency exits." But in the perfect darkness, evacuation quickly became catastrophe. Species accustomed to navigating primarily by sight now stumbled blindly. The sonic guides, secondary systems rarely used or tested, activated with piercing wails that overlapped and confused rather than directed. Collisions occurred throughout the amphitheater as panicked beings rushed toward where they thought exits might be. "We need to restore at least minimal visibility," Mara said to Kalo. "The manual override?" "Manual override requires a complete power purge," he replied grimly. "That would shut down not just the Night Forge, but potentially any system connected to the same electromagnetic spectrum." Mara made a decision. "Do it. The settlement's power grid is secondary to lives. Do it now." Carlo executed the command sequence by touch alone. The Night Forge emitted a high-pitched whine, then fell silent. For a moment, the darkness remained absolute. Then, gradually, pinpricks of light began to appear as the most powerful bioluminescent organisms in the amphitheater recovered. But something was wrong. Throughout the cavern, the normally reliable phosphorescent rivers that provided Noctis 9's ambient illumination remained dark. The backup systems, designed to activate automatically in case of emergency, failed to engage. The electromagnetic pulse from the Night Forge's shutdown had cascaded through the settlement's integrated power grid, temporarily disabling the systems that regulated light throughout the cavern city. In the dim, patchy illumination provided by recovering organic light sources, Mara could see the scope of the chaos. Beings stumbled about in confusion. Several appeared injured from falls or collisions. The council platform was in disarray, with only Thurek maintaining his position, using his personal communicator to attempt to coordinate a response. Eshra stood rigid, his exoskeleton now dark and lifeless, without his bioluminescence. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished. His faceted eyes worked furiously, attempting to gather what little light remained. "Your demonstration has endangered our entire settlement," he said, his voice cold with fury. "If the main illumination system remains offline, structural integrity monitors will fail. The cavern could become unstable." Mara knew he was right. Noctis 9's cavern settlements were maintained through constant monitoring of stress fractures, erosion points, and tectonic shifts. Those systems relied on the same power grid that now lay dormant. "Lieutenant," she said. Decision made. "Prepare the emergency kit. We're going to need the portables." Carlo nodded and moved quickly to their diplomatic box, retrieving a case that the Noctis 9 security had examined and approved as personal effects upon their arrival. Inside were half a dozen devices that resembled small spheres, emergency equipment that the human delegation had brought as a precaution. "What are those?" Thurek had approached, moving with the caution of one navigating by memory rather than sight. "Portable light sources," Mara explained, "but not the kind you're used to. These emit focused sound waves that create three-dimensional maps of physical space. They won't restore your vision, but they will prevent collisions and falls while your systems recover." Thurek's inner eyelids flickered in what might have been skepticism or consideration. "You wish us to navigate by sound, like primitive cave dwellers?" "Like humans," Mara corrected gently. "This is how we adapted, not by seeing darkness, but by learning to move through it using other senses." After a moment's hesitation, Thurek nodded. "Distribute your devices to the emergency responders. I will announce the procedure." As Kalo began handing out the portable mappers to the security personnel who had maintained enough composure to function, Thurek addressed the increasingly frightened crowd. "Citizens of Noctis 9, remain calm. The power disruption is temporary. Emergency responders are being equipped with alternative navigation devices provided by our human guests. Follow their directions to the evacuation points." Eshra stepped forward, mandibles clicking rapidly. "You would have us rely on human technology, the very technology that caused this disaster?" "I would have us survive this crisis," Thurek replied firmly. "Pride can wait for the light's return." Mara approached them, her movements confident even in the near darkness. "Ambassador Vond, I understand your hesitation, but I believe we can do more than merely evacuate. With your permission, I'd like to attempt to restore your power grid." Eshra's faceted eyes fixed on her, reflecting what little light remained in the chamber. "You are responsible for this failure. Why should we trust you to repair it?" "Because I understand what happened," she replied without defensiveness. "The Night Forge created an electromagnetic pulse that overloaded your power distribution nodes. They're not permanently damaged, just temporarily disabled from the surge. We can reset them manually." Thurek's interest was immediate. "The central power hub is 3 levels below us, in the heart of the settlement. And in this darkness," Eshra added pointedly, "the route will be treacherous even with your sound mapping devices. The maintenance tunnels were designed for those with enhanced vision." Mara nodded. "Then I'll need a guide familiar with the tunnels, and Lieutenant Kalo to handle the technical aspects." After a moment of tense silence, Eshra's mandibles clicked once, decisively. "I will guide you. No one knows the infrastructure tunnels better than Xerillians. We designed most of them. The decision made." They moved quickly. Emergency responders equipped with the human sound mappers began guiding citizens toward evacuation points, while Mara, Carlo, Eshra, and 2 Xerillian engineers headed for a maintenance access point at the rear of the amphitheater. The passage descended steeply, narrow enough that they had to proceed in single file. Eshra led, moving with the caution of one navigating from memory rather than sight. Behind him, Mara activated a small personal sound mapper that emitted barely audible pulses, creating a ghostly mental image of the tunnel's dimensions. "Fascinating," one of the Xerillian engineers commented, hearing the subtle pings of the device. "You navigate entirely by reflected sound?" This is an advanced version, Kalo explained from the rear. It translates the echoes into neural impulses that the brain interprets spatially. With practice, it creates a form of sight, just not one based on light. A crude substitute? Escherah remarked ahead of them, but his tone held more curiosity than disdain now. As they descended deeper into the maintenance tunnels, the last remnants of bioluminescent light faded behind them. They were in perfect darkness now, a state that would have terrified most Noctis 9 residents, but through which the humans moved with practiced ease. The tunnel splits ahead, Escherah warned. Left passage descends to the power hub. Right leads to the emergency generators, but those would have been affected by the same pulse. Left, then, Mara confirmed. As they turned into the left passage, a distant rumble vibrated through the rock around them. Loose stones clattered from the ceiling, and a fine dust filled the air. "Tectonic shift," one of the engineers said, alarm evident in his voice, "without the stabilizing field generators." "How long until a major collapse becomes possible?" Mara asked directly. "Difficult to predict," the engineer replied. "The settlement was built in this cavern specifically because it's at the intersection of 3 minor fault lines. The energy from their movement powers our systems, but without the dampening fields." Another rumble, stronger this time, punctuated his explanation. "We need to move faster," Escherah decided, accelerating his pace despite the darkness. They descended 2 more levels, the tunnel occasionally branching or intersecting with other passages. Each time, Escherah navigated by memory, sometimes pausing briefly to run his sensory appendages along specific markers on the wall, texture-based navigation aids that predated modern illumination. "Your people once navigated by touch," Mara observed during one such pause. "In our earliest days on this world," Escherah acknowledged, "before we developed enhanced vision, these markers are maintained as historical artifacts and emergency backups. I never expected to use them." They reached a heavy door that Escherah identified as the entrance to the power hub. Without electricity, its automated systems were non-functional, requiring manual operation. The 2 engineers stepped forward, inserting specialized tools into recessed panels on either side of the door. "Mechanical override," one explained as they turned the tools in coordinated movements. "No electronics." With a heavy sound of releasing pressure, the door swung open to reveal the central power hub of Noctis 9, a vast chamber filled with equipment that now sat dark and silent. Under normal circumstances, the room would pulse with bioluminescent energy conduits and monitoring displays. Now it was a cathedral of dead technology. Lieutenant Kalo immediately moved to what appeared to be the central control console. "Similar architecture to what we've seen on other worlds," he commented, his fingers tracing the layout. The pulse would have triggered the safety protocols, shutting down the entire grid rather than risking cascade failure. "Can you bypass the protocols?" Escherah asked, standing close enough that his now dark exoskeleton nearly touched Kalo's shoulder. "Not bypass, reset," Kalo corrected. "The system did exactly what it should have done when faced with an unexpected energy surge. We just need to tell it the danger has passed." He worked methodically, guided by the sound mapper and his own expertise with similar systems encountered during previous expeditions. The Xerillian engineers assisted, translating specific local protocols and confirming system pathways. Another rumble shook the chamber, stronger than before. Dust and small fragments of rock showered from the ceiling. "The instability is increasing," Mara observed. "How much longer, Lieutenant?" "Almost there," Kalo replied, his focus unwavering. "The primary reset requires simultaneous activation at 3 stations. We'll need to split up." Escherah didn't hesitate. "Tell us what to do." Kalo quickly instructed the 2 engineers and Escherah on the necessary procedures, positioning them at separate stations around the hub. Mara stood by the main console, ready to confirm the reset once all 3 stations reported ready. "On my mark," Kalo said when all were in position. 3, 2, 1, mark. 3 mechanical switches were thrown simultaneously. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low hum that gradually increased in pitch and volume, the power hub began to awaken. Emergency lights flickered to life, casting the chamber in a dim red glow that seemed blindingly bright after the perfect darkness they'd been navigating. Displays illuminated one by one, status indicators shifting from critical red to cautionary yellow. The Xerillian engineers moved quickly from station to station, confirming systems as they came online. Primary grid initializing, one reported. Rerouting power to essential systems first, structural integrity field generators, emergency lighting, life support. Dampening fields are responding, the other added as another. Milder tremor passed through the chamber. Stabilization at 40% and rising. Eshra approached Mara and Kalo, his exoskeleton beginning to glow faintly as its bioluminescent components reconnected to his bioelectric field. His faceted eyes regarded them with an expression difficult to interpret. "Your technology caused this crisis," he said finally, "but your methods helped resolve it. An interesting paradox." "Not a paradox," Mara replied. "Simply different approaches to the same problem. Your people master darkness by seeing through it. We master it by learning to exist within it." The main console chimed, drawing their attention. "Full system recovery estimated in 20 minutes, Kalo reported. "Structural integrity fields are already at sufficient capacity to prevent major collapses." Eshra's mandibles clicked in what might have been reluctant approval. "We should return to the council chamber. Thurek will want a full report." As they made their way back through the tunnels, now dimly illuminated by emergency lighting, Mara noticed a change in Eshra's demeanor. The Xerillian ambassador moved with less rigid formality, occasionally glancing at the sound mappers the humans still carried despite the return of limited visibility. "Your devices," he said during a pause at a junction. "They create a mental image through sound. They translate acoustic information into spatial awareness," Mara explained. "With practice, the brain begins to see spaces and objects through sound rather than light." "Fascinating," Eshra admitted. "During our descent, when we lost all light, I found myself becoming more aware of the tunnel's acoustics, echoes from our movements, air currents against my sensory appendages, information I typically ignore in favor of visual data." Mara nodded. "That's precisely why we developed these technologies, not to replace sight, but to enhance our awareness of aspects of reality that sight can overshadow." They emerged into the main cavern to find order largely restored. Emergency lighting provided sufficient illumination for most species to navigate safely, and the evacuation had been completed without serious injuries. Councillor Thurek was coordinating recovery efforts from a temporary command center established near the amphitheater. "Ambassador, Dr. Albright." Thurek acknowledged them as they approached. "The engineers report power restoration is proceeding faster than expected. Credit to Lieutenant Kalo and the Xerillian engineering team," Mara said. They worked seamlessly together despite the challenging conditions. Thurek's inner eyelids flickered, a sign of approval. "The Council will convene once full power is restored to assess the incident and its implications." His gaze, enhanced by ocular implants that functioned even in the low emergency lighting, fixed on Mara. "Your delegation's status will be under review." "Understood," Mara replied with a formal nod. "We accept full responsibility for the malfunction and stand ready to provide any technical assistance required for full recovery." As they moved away from the command center, Eshra spoke quietly to Mara. "The Council may vote to expel your delegation. Many will see this incident as proof that human technology is dangerous and incompatible with our world." "And what will you vote, Ambassador?" Mara asked directly. Eshra's mandibles clicked softly as he considered. 2 cycles ago, I would have led the call for expulsion. Now, I find myself curious. Your approach to darkness is orthodox. but not without merit. Over the next several hours, power was restored throughout the settlement. Bioluminescent systems reactivated. Phosphorescent rivers resumed their gentle glow, and the familiar twilight ambiance of Noctis 9 returned. With each passing hour, the crisis receded further into memory. Though its impact lingered in subtle ways, residents moving with slightly more caution. Appreciation for light that had previously been taken for granted. As promised, the council convened once stability was fully restored. The 7 members sat in their traditional semicircle, with Thurek at the center. The human delegation was present, as were key representatives from major species groups. The amphitheater, now partially filled with observers, hummed with low conversations that fell silent when Thurek raised his hand. "We gather to address the events of the Festival of Lights," he began formally. "The record will show that a technology demonstration by the Earth delegation resulted in a temporary but significant failure of our power grid and illumination systems." Murmurs rippled through the assembly, but Thurek continued unperturbed. "The record will also show that members of that same delegation provided crucial assistance in restoring power and preventing potential structural damage to our settlement." He gestured to Mara. "Dr. Albright, as representative of Earth, the Council invites your statement." Mara rose and moved to the center of the chamber. Unlike her earlier demonstration, she now stood in full light, her adaptive suit adjusted to neutral reflectivity rather than absorption. "Councillors, citizens of Noctis 9, she began. "I offer no excuses for the malfunction of our technology. The Night Forge was inadequately tested in your specific electromagnetic environment, an oversight for which I take personal responsibility." She paused, looking around at the assembled beings, so many different evolutionary paths, all converging on mastery of vision as the primary adaptation to this twilight world. "But I also stand before you to suggest that perhaps there was value in what occurred. Despite the disruption and fear it caused, for a brief time, many of you experienced true darkness, not as enemy, not as obstacle, but as reality to be navigated through other means." Escherah shifted in his seat among the diplomatic corps, his faceted eyes fixed intently on Mara. "Humans did not evolve enhanced vision," she continued. "Instead, we developed alternative ways of understanding and navigating our world. Touch, sound, even subtle variations in air pressure and temperature, all these became our tools when light failed us." She gestured to where Lieutenant Carlo sat with the rest of the human delegation. "The sound mappers that guided your emergency responders during the blackout represent just one of many technologies we've developed not to overcome darkness, but to embrace what it offers: different perspectives, different sensory experiences, different truths." Thurek leaned forward slightly. "Are you suggesting, Dr. Albright, that the incident was beneficial?" "I am suggesting," Mara replied carefully, "that while the manner of its occurrence was regrettable, the experience itself may have value, not as crisis, but as catalyst for understanding that mastery over darkness can take forms other than vision." From his position, Escherah rose to his feet, an unexpected movement that drew all eyes. "Councillor Thurek, I request permission to address the assembly." Thurek's inner eyelids flickered in surprise, but he nodded. "The council recognizes Ambassador Vond." Escherah moved to stand near Mara, his exoskeleton now fully illuminated in the Zerillian pattern that indicated formal testimony. "I was among those who descended to the power hub during the blackout. I navigated tunnels I have known for decades, yet in the absence of all light, they became unfamiliar territory." His mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "I have prided myself, as have all Zerillians, on our million-facet vision, our evolutionary triumph over darkness. Yet in perfect darkness, this adaptation was meaningless. It was the human sound mappers that guided us, and more significantly, it was the humans themselves who moved with confidence while I hesitated." The admission clearly cost him, but he continued, The Festival of Lights has always celebrated our conquest of darkness through vision. Perhaps we have been celebrating too narrow a victory. Murmurs again rippled through the assembly, but different now, contemplative rather than fearful or angry. Thurek allowed the moment to extend before speaking. The council will deliberate on the incident and its implications. This session is adjourned until tomorrow's first light. As the assembly dispersed, Mara found herself approached by Eshera. They stood at the edge of the amphitheater, where the phosphorescent river curved around the perimeter, casting everything in a soft blue glow. "Your words to the council were carefully chosen," Eshera observed. "You did not mention that your Night Forge was designed primarily as art, not merely as practical technology." Mara smiled slightly. "I thought that aspect might be better demonstrated than explained, once the initial shock has passed." "Dark sculpting," Eshra said, testing the unfamiliar concept. "Creating forms from absence rather than presence. It began as entertainment," Mara acknowledged, "but evolved into something more profound. In complete darkness, many humans report a sense of liberation, freedom from visual distractions, from the tyranny of appearance. Some of our most significant philosophical and scientific insights have emerged from deliberate sensory reduction." Ishra's faceted eyes studied her with new interest. "Your species deliberately enters darkness for enlightenment?" "Some do," Mara confirmed. "Darkness meditation has a long history on Earth. The absence of visual input can heighten other senses, can make space for thoughts and perceptions that visual processing might otherwise crowd out." "Fascinating," Eshra said, and for once, there was no trace of condescension in his tone. "I should like to learn more of this practice. If circumstances permit, I would be honored to share it," Mara replied, "though perhaps with a more carefully calibrated Night Forge." The following day, the council reconvened as promised. The amphitheater was filled to capacity, with citizens eager to hear the decision regarding the human delegation and their controversial technology. Thurek called the session to order with traditional formality, but there was something different in his demeanor, a thoughtfulness that suggested the deliberations had been substantive rather than merely procedural. "After extensive consideration," he announced, "the Council has reached a unanimous decision regarding the events of the Festival of Lights and the status of the Earth delegation." The Assembly held its collective breath. "The technology known as the Night Forge will be subject to comprehensive safety protocols developed jointly by human and Noctis 9 engineers. No public demonstrations will be permitted until these protocols are certified by the Council." He paused, inner eyelids flickering in what those familiar with his expressions recognized as mild amusement. "However, the Council has also determined that the principles underlying this technology and the alternative sensory navigation methods demonstrated by the humans during the crisis represent potentially valuable contributions to our world. Therefore, we extend an invitation to Dr. Mara Albright and her team to establish a cultural exchange program focused on what they call dark arts and our own traditions of light mastery." The announcement prompted a mixture of reactions: surprise, curiosity, some lingering skepticism, but predominantly positive interest. The fear that had dominated during the blackout had been replaced by intellectual engagement with new possibilities. Eshra, seated now among the diplomatic corps, inclined his head slightly toward Mara, a gesture of respect rarely offered by Xerillians to outsiders. In the weeks that followed, a remarkable transformation occurred within Noctis 9 society. What had begun as a frightening malfunction evolved into a cultural movement. Under carefully controlled conditions, small groups began to experience the Night Forge's darkness as Mara had originally intended, not as crisis but as canvas. Xerillian engineers, working alongside Lieutenant Carlo, developed safety modifications that prevented uncontrolled expansion of the dark field. Artists from various species began experimenting with dark sculpting, creating forms that existed only as absence, visible by their boundaries against light rather than through direct perception. Most surprising was the emergence of what became known as void meditation, a practice pioneered by Ishira himself, who discovered that in complete darkness, his sensory appendages detected subtle environmental variations he had never before noticed. The practice spread rapidly among younger Xyrillians, who found in darkness a complementary experience to their celebrated vision, not a replacement, but an expansion of sensory possibility. 3 cycles after the incident, a very different festival took place in the same amphitheater, now called the Festival of Shadows. It alternated demonstrations of enhanced vision with periods of controlled darkness during which performers navigated by sound, touch, and other non-visual senses. Mara and Eshera stood side by side at the event's conclusion, watching as the final demonstration transitioned from brilliant, bioluminescent display to sculpted darkness and back again, light and void in harmonious alternation rather than opposition. "Your people have embraced darkness with remarkable enthusiasm," Mara observed. "Not embraced," Eshera corrected, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "Incorporated. We still value our vision. It remains our evolutionary triumph. But we have learned that sight is not the only path to understanding. Different approaches to the same reality," Mara said with a smile. "Indeed." Eshra's faceted eyes reflected the shifting patterns of light and dark above them. "Though I admit, I did not anticipate becoming an advocate for void meditation when you first activated your Night Forge." "The best discoveries are often unexpected," Mara replied. "On Earth, we have a saying, 'Sometimes you must enter the darkness to see the stars.'" Eshra considered this. Poetic, but astronomically questionable. "Stars are more visible in darkness due to contrast, not because of the darkness itself." Mara laughed. "Some human sayings prioritize metaphor over literal accuracy. A trait your species shares with the Morphics," Eshra noted dryly. "They have composed 17 ballads about the blackout already, each more dramatically exaggerated than the last." As the festival concluded and the gathered species began to disperse, Councillor Thurek approached them. His age-faded skin seemed to have regained some of its youthful aquamarine hue in recent cycles. "Dr. Albright," he greeted Mara formally. "The Council has received your proposal for the next phase of cultural exchange. The concept of a dark theater, where stories are conveyed entirely through sound and touch, is unprecedented." "But not unwelcome?" Mara asked. Thurek's inner eyelids flickered in what she had come to recognize as his version of a smile. "Quite the contrary. After initial hesitation, there is considerable interest, particularly among our younger citizens. They seem eager to experience storytelling through non-visual means." "And you, Counselor?" Eshra inquired. "Will you attend the inaugural performance?" Thurek looked out over the amphitheater, now illuminated by the familiar twilight glow of Noctis 9. "I find myself curious," he admitted. "In all my cycles, I never imagined finding value in darkness. Yet here we are, creating art from absence, wisdom from the void." Later that evening, as Noctis 9's dim star dipped below the horizon, creating what passed for night on this twilight world, a small group gathered in a specially prepared chamber deep within the settlement. Humans and aliens sat together around what appeared to be a black sphere hovering in the center, a controlled field generated by the refined Night Forge. "On Earth," Mara explained to the assembled beings, "we have a tradition called sitting around the campfire. People gather in darkness with only the fire's light, sharing stories, discovering truths that daylight sometimes obscures." She gestured to the dark sphere. "This is our version of that tradition, a dark fire around which we gather not to see, but to listen, to feel, to sense in ways that light cannot capture." One by one, the chamber's illumination panels dimmed until only the negative space of the Night Forge's field remained visible, a perfect void around which they sat in semi-darkness. "Who will begin?" Mara asked softly. To everyone's surprise, it was Ashera who spoke first, his voice emerging from the gathering twilight with none of its former rigidity. "In the oldest Xyrillian texts," he began, "before we developed million-facet vision, our ancestors spoke of void wisdom, knowledge that could only be gained when all light failed and one was forced to navigate by memory and touch alone. I always considered these stories primitive superstition. Now I wonder what other truths we might have overlooked in our quest to master sight." As night deepened around them, humans and aliens continued to share stories, not seeing each other across the darkness, but perhaps, in some ways, perceiving each other more clearly than ever before. In her quarters, later, Mara recorded in her official log, "Darkness is neither friend nor foe. It is possibility. On a world obsessed with vision, we have introduced the art of unsight, the wisdom of the void. And in doing so, perhaps we have all begun to truly see."